You. All right, folks. So as Marcella said, welcome to the PREA Audits as an Advocacy Tool office hours. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. And we're going to go ahead and do some introductions. My name is Jenica Sinor. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm a project coordinator here at Valor. And I'll pass to my colleagues here, Marcella and Jessica.
Thank you, Jenica. Hi, everyone. I'm Marcela. I will be essentially your tech support today. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'll be relaying them to Jessica when it makes sense for her to answer them. So please do use the chat. And if we have time at the end, I will also open it up for questions to unmute yourself. So just depends on how long it takes us to get through everything. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon. I hope it's warm where you are. I think it's rainy for most of us. Hopefully you're able to stay warm and dry. I'm so happy to be here. And yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started.
Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against, no, are we going back to Zoom? Wait, you already went over it. So yeah, we can just do the.
Okay.
Okay.
I guess I'll just also add that we'll have the slides and recordings available later. So if you want to share this with your staff, you can share that. And if you are using your phone, you can use *6 to unmute yourself. And I'll pass it to the next slide.
So Valor US, formerly known as CalCASA, the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, is committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. Ultimately, we envision a world free from violence where the dignity of every person is valued and respected. Now in its 8th year, the California Office of Emergency Services, Cal-OES, funded the California Advancing PREA project, allowing both Valor and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers on how to build strong relationships with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or CDCR, county jails, and juvenile facility staff. We provide guidance on how to create sustainable agreements for the provision of victim services to survivors. Although much progress has been made, we really understand that there continues to be a gap and challenges in services available to survivors behind bars.
All right, and then Just Attention International, or JDI, which is where I work, has been partnering with Valor for all 8 of those years. I can't believe it's been 8 years that we've been doing this project. JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So JDI's core principle is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, that rape is not part of the penalty. It's our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it also takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. And here are the objectives for our conversation that we're going to have together today. We're going to talk a little bit about so the PREA audit process and sort of what that looks like from start to finish. We'll talk about some ways that you as advocates can get involved, and then also some resources to learn more about the PREA audit process if this is not enough for you, because there's always more to learn.
And before we get started, we just wanted to get a sense of how many of you may have been called by a PREA auditor, how many of you may have participated in a PREA audit as a victim advocate. We anticipate not very many of you have been able to participate or get called by a PREA auditor, and that is not your fault and not something that you should worry about. We'll give you a sense of how you can participate and how you can get folks to call you and provide them feedback on your relationship. I'm seeing one person say they've been called and that they participated. So that's good news. At least we have one person that's experienced that. But also shows the importance of this webinar. Okay, I'll go ahead and share results. Yeah, about 80% of you are saying no
Mm.
and percent have, and that 10% is one person.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be able to change those numbers. All right. So let's just talk about some of the absolute most basic stuff. I do want to point out really quickly that when I was putting this together, I Googled PREA and this image came up. This is a Brazilian guinea pig, also called PREA. Who knew? Anyway, so in order for facilities to say that they are PREA compliant, they have to go through a PREA audit to determine that compliance. So there is no PREA compliance without a PREA audit. Passing the PREA audit means complying with every single PREA standard, of which there are 50 something, and then every single substandard within those standards. So every standard has its language, and then there's A, B, C, D, et cetera, et cetera. Every single one of those ABCDs have to be complied with as well. One of the things that makes a PREA audit different than a lot of the other kinds of audits that corrections facilities go through is that it's really an audit about practice. So an auditor is supposed to really be in the facility observing some of these practices. It's a lot more than just looking at a policy and making sure that the policy is right. It's also about sort of how is that policy being put into practice. And we can go to the next slide. So this is some dry kind of government-y stuff, but I think it might be interesting to at least kind of get a sense of what the structure is of PREA and sort of who's in charge of it. And so the real powerhouses are the folks in the PREA Management Office, or PMO, a lot of acronyms. And this is an office housed under the Department of Justice at the federal level. These are the folks that are responsible for basically all of the decision making regarding PREA, including audit oversight or auditor oversight. They make all the decisions, and they also take care of the governor assurances, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the PREA Management Office partners with the PREA Resource Center. That might be a name that might be a little more familiar to folks. The PREA Resource Center is sort of like a one-stop shop for all things PREA related. It's hosted by a nonprofit called Impact Justice, and they are responsible for training and support for corrections, for auditors, and they sort of implement whatever decisions the PREA Management Office gives. And then the PREA auditors are trained by the PREA Resource Center, and that training is determined by the PREA Management Office. And PREA auditors are tasked with doing independent, objective, and credible evaluations of PREA compliance. And then, of course, maintaining that active certification, kind of like the advocate certification that most folks have. There's ongoing education requirements. It's pretty similar for PREA auditors. So I think every 3 years or so, they have to maintain that certification and keep it active, and they're not able to do audits unless they do so. I do want to also just point out that the PREA Management Office is really just 4 people. So there's 4 people in this ginormous bureaucracy that are responsible for the entirety of the Prison Rape Elimination Acts across the country. So as you can imagine, these are very overworked people, and that's partly why things move so darn slowly. And you can move on to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, and you know what? I should have said earlier, I forgot to, but I'll say it now. If anyone has any questions, I think Marcella is monitoring the chat, so please feel free to just go ahead and enter those in. So who are the PREA auditors? Typically, not exclusively, but typically they are current or former corrections officials. So you can already imagine right then and there, right, how that could potentially cause some problems. I'm excited to say that as of December of last year, I am also a PREA auditor. So that's why I put typically, not exclusively. I was the only non-corrections person in my graduating class. As I mentioned earlier, they are trained and certified by the Department of Justice. One of the ways that they try to get around potential conflicts of interest is that anyone who's auditing a facility cannot have received financial compensation from that agency 3 years prior or 3 years after. So in other words, it can't be a recent employee or someone who got, a big contract from the agency to do something. It has to be someone who is disconnected from the agency in that way. Next slide. Another way that they get around potential conflicts of interest is something called a consortium. This is something that CDCR is a part of, which is why I thought it would be cool to just share kind of a little bit how it works. Let's just pretend, for example, this would never be real life, but let's pretend that myself, Jenica, and Marcella are all corrections agencies, right? We could enter into an agreement where we would all audit each other, as you can see here. However, I can't audit Marcella and have Marcella audit me, right? Because you can imagine we could come up with some sort of like agreement, like, oh, I'll look, away for this, you look away for that. That's not how it's going to work. So there has to be a minimum of 3 sort of entities in order to enter into a consortium. CDCR, I think the consortium they're in has 4 or so other State Department of Corrections folks. And so if you're looking, for example, at CDCR audits, you're very likely to see some of the same names popping up, and they may very well be from the same Department of Corrections in another state. The reason for that is, for example, Wisconsin Department of Corrections is in a consortium with CDCR. And I believe Washington State and maybe Hawaii is another one. So there's always going to be sort of this circular way that that these audits sort of take place. And again, this is just another way to try to get around any conflicts of interest. Facilities and agencies, again, cannot audit each other. All right, so how do audits get started? I know this was a question that has come up a few times recently. And I wish that I could give you all these like really awesome answers that put sort of any concerns at ease. And unfortunately, I cannot do that because audits are initiated by the facility. So a facility or an agency has to opt in and say, all right, we're ready for PREA audits, right? Not every facility or agency is ready for PREA audits, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but doesn't want to participate in PREA at all. Those that do have to initiate the audit themselves. So the facility can contact an auditor directly. There are some auditing companies that's like a company of a team of auditors, and they can work through that as well. One sort of measure that may help a little bit is that in order for an audit to go forward, the PREA management office has to approve it. So the PREA management office is going to look to make sure that the auditor certification is up to date. They're going to make sure that there isn't sort of that conflict of interest situation coming in. And then once the PREA management approves that audit, the audit can go ahead and move forward. All right, next slide, please. All right, communicating with auditors. So, earlier it seems like most folks have not really had much communication with auditors, and that's something that I would love to see. I would love to see more communication because, as you can see here, this is language directly from the PREA standards. Incarcerated people and advocates should be having communication with auditors. So as you can see here, incarcerated people, quote, shall be permitted to send confidential information or correspondence to the auditor in the same manner as if they were communicating with legal counsel. So incarcerated people should be able to write to auditors before they come to the facility to alert them to any particular issues. Sometimes if an auditor does receive mail from an incarcerated person, they may ask to talk to that person when they come to an audit on site. You can see the second bullet right here. Auditors shall attempt to communicate with community-based or victim advocates who may have insight into relevant conditions in the facility. That would be you all, right? So auditors are supposed to, every time they do an audit, reach out to whoever the victim advocate organization is, just to get a sense from them of, what conditions are like in the facility, whether the facility is sort of in their eyes, communicative and doing all the things that they're supposed to do. However, as you all know, that rarely happens. One of the reasons for that is, although it's sort of required, as you can see in the PREA standards, there isn't a sort of a specific interview protocol for auditors to use when they're talking to advocates. So there's an interview protocol for incarcerated people, for staff, and for all kinds of everything in between, questions that auditors are supposed to ask, right? So they're not just going off script, they're sticking with the script. There is no such script that is required for advocates. And I think because of that, they end up kind of falling to the wayside or they're less of a priority. One of my sort of advocacy pet projects right now is trying to get some sort of interview script included with the required auditor materials, so that I think that that will increase the number of auditors that are actually reaching out and doing what they're supposed to do. I will put into the chat here a link to a sort of supplemental guide that JDI helped to create. This is something that is offered to auditors. It is not required. But as an advocate, it may be something that could be helpful for you if you're talking with an auditor, just to get a sense of what questions they should be asking, and if they're not asking them, what information you should be sharing with them anyway. And Selena, I see the question from you, and actually we'll talk about that in just a moment. All right. And one thing I do want to say as well is that you don't have to wait for auditors to reach out to you. If you know that an audit is coming, and we'll talk about that in a second, you can reach out to the auditor directly. We'll show you how you can look that up. I would encourage you to go ahead and do that, especially since we know that so many auditors are just missing the mark here when it comes to reaching out to the advocates. All right, Marcella, go for it. Yes, so Selena, to answer your question here, there are 3 phases to a PREA audit. The pre-on-site, so before they come in person, the on-site portion, and then everything that happens afterwards. For each portion, there are certain things that facilities are required to do and that auditors are required to do. So before they come on site, a facility is supposed to post a notice of an upcoming audit no less than 6 weeks prior to an on-site audit. That notice has the instructions for contacting auditors confidentially via mail. And facilities are supposed to complete a very, very lengthy, I think it's about 50 pages, a pre-audit questionnaire that includes basically all of the stuff that they're required to give auditors, all the documentation, all the policies, the training materials, all kinds of stuff. All of that happens before an auditor even comes to a facility. One of the things an auditor is supposed to do is also, again, reach out to the advocacy organization before coming to the facility. Now, sometimes doesn't always work out that way. I've seen some folks reach out after the fact. That's not always ideal, but they are supposed to reach out to you all within that sort of 6-week window. Once an auditor comes on site, the facility must allow that auditor full access to every area of the facility. And for those of you who have been inside facilities, I assume most of you have, I'm sure you've seen that a lot of the housing units are sort of copy pastes of each other. They look very similar. And so a lot of times if you're going on a tour of a facility, for example, corrections folks might say, oh, we don't need to go in there. It looks just like this one, right? Which is okay for a facility tour. For an audit, the auditor needs to go into every single building that incarcerated people have access to, regardless if it is a copy paste of a different housing unit. Even if there's no people housed in that unit currently, they should still be going into every single housing unit, documenting everything that they see. For example, they're looking to make sure that the posters for contacting you all as emotional support services are up there. They're looking to make sure that folks have appropriate levels of privacy when they're changing, when they're using the shower, that kind of stuff. Auditors also interview folks, as I mentioned earlier, when they're on site. There's a minimum requirement for how many interviews an auditor is supposed to do, depending on the size of the facility. So for example, a facility that has anywhere between 500 to 1,000 people, there's a required minimum of at least 3 interviews with someone who has reported sexual abuse in the facility, and at least 2 with someone who disclosed at intake. So that's 5 interviews with survivors at minimum that are supposed to happen in these facilities. Now, a facility can't say, oh, you don't want to talk to that person, or, oh, that person has, maybe a mental health issue. You're not going to get anything out of them, right? They can't prevent an auditor from talking to somebody, essentially. Now, auditors are actually required to talk to folks that have disabilities, for example, folks that are transgender, folks that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, et cetera. I think Marcella put a link to the PREA auditor handbook in there, so you can see sort of all the different sort of requirements of folks that they're supposed to interview. And again, a facility can't prevent anyone. If there are no survivors there at that time, sorry, Selena, I see your question, then there's nobody to interview, and that's just something that would have to be marked in the final audit report. It's pretty unlikely in a larger facility, especially, that would be the case. Like I would be suspicious, let's say, if a CDCR facility said that, because there's far too many people in these facilities for there not to be a single person. Now, if you're thinking about like maybe a smaller facility, a jail, maybe that houses 20 people, yeah, that's probably, it's possible. For the larger jails and the CDCR facilities, I would be really shocked if there was any facility anywhere that doesn't have any survivors in there. I will also say too that even if the facility says, oh, we don't have any survivors here, auditors also ask incarcerated people that question, kind of frankly, when they're doing the interview, if that's something that they've ever experienced. So sometimes auditors will get disclosures from folks during the interview process, which is one way actually that you all as advocates can help to get involved in these audits, and we'll talk about that later as well. Another thing that auditors, again, are supposed to do when they are on site is to test the hotline phone, to actually use the same phone that incarcerated people use, place a call to the crisis hotline, your hotlines, to check to make sure that the line is working, that someone answers. They may even ask some questions of the person that answers the phone, right? So that may be something that you want to think about for your hotline staff, right? Or whoever it is that answers the phones, that they may be getting a phone call randomly from an auditor from some facility, and to kind of be prepared for that possibility. So for the post on-site, so the on-site portion, which can take anywhere from a day to a week or even more, all of that happens. And then there's all this work that happens after the facility, right? So, or after the on-site portion. So the facility has to provide any additional information that the auditor needs. The facility also has to comply with any corrective action period as needed. So if an auditor does their report and they say, hey, this facility is 100% compliant, there's nothing to work on, then they write up their report and it's done, right? Let's say, for example, though, that a facility, didn't meet one or two of the standards, right? So the auditor will alert the facility to the stuff that they're missing, and give them 180 days as a corrective action period to fix whatever the issue is, before a final report is done. So if a facility doesn't fix their problems within that 180-day window, the audit report goes out as non-compliant, essentially. So again, they have that window of time. An auditor, when they get back to their homes after the facility site visit, do a final review of all of the evidence, and then write that final audit report that you all have probably seen versions of for the facilities that you're working with. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, so one of the questions that advocates ask a lot about is, what are some of the legal options that survivors might have? What sort of legally does PREA provide for survivors? And, PREA is not a criminal law. So basically what that means is that an agency or a facility cannot be sued for PREA violations specifically. Violating PREA is not a crime. So non-compliance alone is not enough to file any sort of civil suit. Now, non-compliance can support other claims. So like, let's say, for example, someone is filing a lawsuit around, a constitutional violation, or some other sort of legal violation, which sexual abuse is, right? Being able to point to, and the facility, isn't doing all the things that they're supposed to do under PREA, that only makes that case stronger, but it can't be the only thing that the case is about, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so if folks have questions, I may not be able to answer them. But in essence, folks are not filing lawsuits, folks are not being charged for PREA violations, right? Sexual abuse is going to be a crime no matter what. But for PREA specifically, there's no sort of PREA violation that's criminal. All right, next slide. So PREA audit oversight. This is another area that I know a lot of advocates have a lot of questions about. And I'll just be frank that the oversight process is not great. As I mentioned, there are 4 people in the PREA management office. They just do not have the capacity to be reviewing every single audit report, right? That's just, it doesn't happen. At this point, really the only way that either an audit report or an auditor can be flagged for review is via the auditor feedback form, which we'll go over in a moment. So that is a feedback form online where anyone can submit any sort of feedback, complaint, concern, what have you, about an audit or an auditor. Now, if you know, if the PMO receives sort of a complaint about that, they will do a follow-up, they will review the report, they will decertify an auditor if it's a really serious issue, and that means that that auditor cannot do audits anymore. The other thing I will say is that that process, that structural oversight that I'm talking about, is really for state prisons only. Now, all of these resources that you know about, that we've been talking about, are really for state prison. Local jails are just really far behind on PREA compliance. And I think one of the reasons is that, one, there just haven't been a lot of resources dedicated specifically to those kinds of facilities for compliance. And 2, the oversight is just way, way less for the smaller jails or local jails than it is for the state prisons, right? I see that Marcella has put the link to the feedback form there, and we'll go into a little more detail about it in a moment. One thing I do want to say as well, and this doesn't apply to California necessarily, but just might be interesting, is at this point, I think every state except for Alaska and Utah has either certified that they're PREA compliant or has alerted the PREA management office that they are on their way to it. Alaska and Utah at this point are saying, we're not going to participate in this, right? They have until actually December of last year to have, made a decision about that, and that hasn't happened yet. So I'm looking forward to seeing what, if anything, will happen with Utah and Alaska specifically, to see sort of what those next steps are going to be. Like I said, every other state, including California, has submitted that they're either PREA compliant or working on it. The states that have said they're working on it, again, have until December of last year to have finished it. So we're going to be at this point here coming up where a lot of state agencies that either said they're working on it or said we don't want to work on it are going to be facing some music of some kind. I have no idea what that's going to look like. We'll keep you all posted. As soon as I know something, you all will know something. One thing I do want to say as well is one of the sort of early versions of PREA audit oversight was if a state said that they were not compliant yet, they would take away 5% of federal funding for prisons for that facility. And the facility was required to reroute that 5% towards PREA compliance specifically. I think that's how we ended up actually with a lot of sites getting more compliant, is that they were sort of had money taken away from them that they could only use for PREA compliance. That was really kind of the only stick, if you will, that occurred for these earlier years in the PREA audit process. At this point, like I said, it's just Utah and Alaska, so we'll see what happens with them. All right, so how advocates can get involved? There's a few different ways, and I want to point to the auditor feedback form again. I kind of want to like give a call to action to everyone listening to like really take advantage of that feedback auditor form. For example, if you know that the facility you're working with was audited and that your agency was not contacted, that's a perfect excuse to use the auditor feedback form. If an auditor talks with you and is pressuring you to give information about a survivor or to break confidentiality or is unprofessional in some other way, auditor feedback form, right? We know that that really is the primary way that audits and auditors are flagged for review. So I think it's something that we should all feel really empowered to use. It's something that we can help you use if you aren't sure, or if you just want some extra support in doing so. We are absolutely here to help you with that. In my mind, I sort of have this vision of like the PREA Resource Center being flooded with auditor feedback forms about folks not being called or something like that. That's what I want to see happen, so that folks really have a good understanding of what's happening. And yes, this is for the auditor, not the facility. So this is in case an auditor is not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. Yes. Another way that I have seen advocates get involved, and this is something that I know they did in New Mexico actually, is they had advocates help facilities with mock PREA audits, which I think is super, super cool. They basically did what an auditor would do. They came on site, they did the site tour, they interviewed people, they looked through the policies, they looked through the staff training curriculum, they looked through all kinds of stuff in order to help prepare some of these facilities for the eventual PREA audits, right? And advocates were there on site to help that process happen, which I think is super cool. Another way that advocates can get involved is for either in-person and or follow-up support for survivors or others that are being interviewed, right? So earlier I mentioned that survivors are likely to be interviewed by auditors depending on how many there are. As you can imagine, that can be really triggering. Not every auditor is going to have the skills to be able to have that conversation in a really compassionate, empathetic way. And so having the option to talk with, one of you all after an interview can be really, really powerful. I know that that can either be done in person, like you can actually be there when the audit is happening to offer that support, or the auditor can provide your agency's information after the interview, which is something that they're encouraged to do anyway. Again, like with the understanding that those conversations can be really triggering. One thing I do want to say though is that just because a facility passes an audit and is fully PREA compliant, as you all know, that doesn't mean that there's no abuse happening at that facility, right? So PREA compliance is not a stamp of oh, there's not abuse here at all. That's not what PREA can do, right? What PREA compliance means is that the facility is taking all of the steps necessary to prevent sexual abuse, that they have their policies in place, they have their protocols in place, that staff know what to do, that incarcerated people know what services are available, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no abuse happening at a facility. And so, one of the things that I think facilities sometimes say is, oh, well, we're passing our PREA audits, we don't need your help, right? And I think the sort of follow-up to that is, I'm so glad you're passing your PREA audits. That's great. There still may be survivors in your facility that need support, right? Whether you're PREA compliant or not. All right, so Marcella is going to actually do a screen share here, and we're going to look up on the audit search all the different CDCR audits that are either coming up or have just happened, just so that you all can see how to use it. So there's two different sites, actually. There's a way to look up auditors and there's a way to look up audits. So we're going to look up audits because that is sort of the funner piece. This is a website on the PREA Resource Center where you can search by facility name, you can search by dates, you can search by agency name, you can search by auditor name, all of this stuff, and it'll tell you as of June 2022, any audits that have happened or even are coming up, right? So it's something that I would encourage folks to like check every few months or something just to see if an audit is coming up. Knowing that we may not necessarily count on facilities, ensuring that auditors contact you. We know auditors are kind of touch and go about contacting you. This is a way to sort of be a little proactive, right? So as you can see here, if you put in California Department of Corrections, you hit search, and it'll show you all of the audits that, again, either have happened as of June 2022 or are coming up, right? So for example, let's see, California Rehabilitation Center, we can see that they are going to have an audit in a couple weeks, right? So if I were working at that crisis center, I would want to know, okay, has the auditor reached out to me? Have they called the hotline? Maybe they talked to someone else. And if they haven't, then I'm gonna see, okay, who is that auditor? Maria something or other. I'm gonna look up that person in the auditor search. And when I do that, it's gonna show their contact information. So I can reach out to Maria directly and say, hey, I work at such and such a crisis center. I saw that this facility was being audited. I'm not sure if you have reached out to us yet. I'd love to talk with you, all that kind of stuff. There's absolutely no need to wait for them to reach out to you. This right here is the auditor search page that I was referring to. So you can look up specific auditors in here. So again, if whoever that person's name was in the other audit, you can plug their name in here. This database shows certified auditors and decertified auditors. You can also look and see if someone is decertified in here. I'm not sure I don't think it explains why, but it'll at least tell you if they're certified or not. So I would encourage folks again to check the audit search function every so often, just to see, if there's an audit coming up that maybe the facility is not letting you know about. Now, audits typically happen once every 3 years, right? So if an audit has recently happened, there may not be an opportunity to sort of do that intervention, in that moment. I will say, though, that if you see, for example, that an audit happened last week, right? We know that post-audit period takes forever. So you may still be able to contact an auditor. They may not have finished their report just yet if it's been a week or two. And that was actually it. I was so worried that we were going to run out of time. Maybe I have had too much coffee and I am speaking way too quickly. And if that's the case, I am so sorry. But now is the time for questions. So if folks have any questions or any issues or any feelings or anything that they want to talk through, now's the time. It was just that good.
So
Is there any way to find out when a facility's last audit was? Yeah, so the website that Marcella was just at, again, this is as of June 2022. So if it happened since then, it will be on that database. If it happened before then, agencies should have, again, there's that should word, should have final audit reports available on their website. That's information that's supposed to be publicly available. The final audit report, as well as annual reports of sexual abuse statistics in their facilities, are supposed to be published and publicly available. CDCR, for example, is one of those agencies that does have all of that stuff available on their website. Some of your smaller agencies or your county facilities may not. The ones that are really far behind in PREA may not, but your CDCR facilities will. So if you go to their website, in fact, I'll put it in the chat right now, you can look up not only PREA audits, but you can look up the annual statistics as well for different facilities. Put that in the chat. There we go. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That was the wrong link. I'm so sorry. Let me fix that.
I just dropped the directory for the PREA audit. So if that's what you're looking for, it should be in the chat now.
There we go. I know so many links. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But the CDCR website, you can see the annual reports dating back to 2015, and the more recent PREA final reports for the facilities are up there as well. There's even a coming soon section. My goodness. Not a lot of other agencies are going to have quite that extensive stuff on their websites, even though they're supposed to. All right. Any other questions or concerns, feelings?
It sounds like you covered it all, or maybe folks will be thinking about questions later on once they do start getting calls, crossing our fingers from PREA auditors, or now you know how to reach out to them and find them with these directories.
Yeah. And if you forget everything that we just talked about in a couple months and you're aware an audit is coming and you need help kind of navigating all of this stuff again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to help you all kind of navigate all of this stuff. If you had a sketchy experience with an auditor or something like that, or an auditor didn't reach out to you, you're not sure if you want to fill out a feedback form, same thing, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can kind of help support you all in figuring all this stuff out. I know it's a lot.
And I actually just got a private message from someone checking to see if we were in the Q&A section since they had to take a call. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself. You don't need to use the chat. So
yeah,
I'll wait and see if anyone else has a question.
I have a question actually, Marcella, and I don't know if you already answered this early on, but are the slides going to be
Yes.
shared with everyone? Okay.
Yeah, so we'll have the slides up. We'll have all the links that we shared in the chat, and we'll also have the recording up on our website. So we'll be sending out via newsletter. All right. Any other questions? I don't think that. Okay, I see a question. Is there a way to know if there's an audit coming? Okay, so yeah, we had mentioned earlier the directory. So if you look in the chat, you will definitely see access to a searchable directory of PREA audits as well as a directory of PREA auditors. So you can.
And right now, based on the website we just looked at, there's only 2 audits coming up for CBCR facilities, right? All the other facilities haven't scheduled theirs yet, or perhaps they were audited very recently and only get audited every 3 years. And again, like if you look and find that the facility you're working with had an audit a year ago or 2 years ago and no one contacted you, let us know. Let us know, and we can complain to some people.
All right, y'all. Well, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I will put my email in the chat, and I'm sure Jenica and Jessica will do the same.
Yes.
If you find that you look up the directory and you notice there's an audit coming up, you can go ahead and again search the PREA auditor in the other directory. So, and then reach out to us if you need any support. Yeah, we appreciate you all making this webinar, and we'll send the recording out soon. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for all of your work. Stay dry.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica.